Welcome to episode 127 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue with Epicurus' letter to Pythocles with a look at the formation of worlds. Joshua is away today, so let's now join Don reading today's text.
A world is a circumscribed portion of sky containing heavenly bodies and an earth and all the heavenly phenomena, whose dissolution will cause all within it to fall into confusion. It is a piece cut off from the infinite and ends in a boundary either rare or dense, either revolving or stationary. Its outline may be spherical or three-cornered or any kind of shape. For all such conditions are possible, seeing that no phenomenon is evidenced against this in our world, in which it is not possible to perceive an ending. And that such worlds are infinite in number we can be sure, and also that such a world may come into being both inside another world and in an interworld, by which we mean a space between worlds. It will be in a place with much void, and not in a large empty space, quite void, as some say. This occurs when seeds of the right kind have rushed in from a single world or interworld, or from several. Little by little, they make junctions and articulations and cause changes of position to another place, as it may happen, and produce irrigations of the appropriate matter until the period of completion and stability, which lasts as long as the underlying foundations are capable of receiving addition. For it is not merely necessary for a gathering of atoms to take place, nor indeed for a whirl and nothing more to be set in motion, as is supposed by necessity in an empty space in which it is possible for a world to come into being. Nor can the world go on increasing until it collides with another world, as one of the so-called physical philosophers says. For this is a contradiction of phenomena. Sun and moon and the other stars were not created by themselves and subsequently taken in by the world, but were fashioned in it from the first and gradually grew in size by the aggregations and whirlings of bodies of minute parts, either windy or fiery or both, for this is what our sensation suggests.
Okay, thank you for reading that, Don. In our episode today, we are down one person. Joshua is traveling and not able to join us, and we have Don back today. So Don and Martin and I will do the best we can with the text that Don has just read for us. Before we jump into what you just read, Don, it'd probably be worthwhile to remind somebody who just starts listening to this podcast today that what Epicurus has just said in the preceding passage is that we don't go investigating science according to arbitrary principles. What we're really attempting to do is to make sure we have a reasonable basis for living happily and to avoid irrational beliefs and groundless imaginings. And as long as we have at least one theory or even several that is consistent with phenomena, then that's basically where we need to be. And in fact, it becomes a hazard if you attempt to choose among the several theories that are consistent with the evidence. If you decide to pick one as your favorite, even though there are several that are consistent with the evidence, then that also is a problem, and potentially a really big problem, because you're leaving the path of rational scientific exploration and you're falling into something that's really not any different than myth if you yourself, without evidentiary basis, eliminate a viable option and choose only one among several. So that's the background of where we are. So what we'll be talking about today will be an example of his analysis of several types of possible explanations.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because we also have his stance that if you come up with several material-based, physical-based explanations, that you can pretty well roll out any supernatural causes as well. That's one of the major reasons for coming up with several material universe-based causes of things. You're like, well, if they can happen this way and this way and this way, and then you're also going to bring in these supernatural beings, well, you don't really need the supernatural beings then after all.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that the point I've just been making there is so obvious that it really doesn't need to be made. But the more I think about it, also, I think it does need to be made because it's very natural for people to have a pet theory or just to, on their own, decide that one makes more sense to them than another does, which is all well and good. But unless you're rigorously keeping in your mind whether the evidence is conclusive or not, then it really is something that's not that far from a religious or faith-based attitude.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't have the evidence to support it, then you really are just taking it on faith.
And once you go down that road too, any evidence that somebody presents to you, you're going to fit that square peg in a round hole of your own theory and say, well, according to my theory, your evidence shows this and this and this, even though it's like it may be convoluted and twisted around and all that sort of thing. Because then if you're staked on defending that one pet theory, then you're just going to see everything in through that lens.
Yeah, it's almost like we tend to look at everything in a mathematical, probabilistic way. It's like if we come up with 5 possibilities and we think that one of them is 50.1% more likely than the others, well, that's good for us to recognize that it is 50.1%, but to conclude that that's the only one to even consider, that everything else should be just thrown out, I think that would be wrong. You can both keep in your mind the probability, but at the same time realize that there's a difference between probability and certainty. That's why we have 2 separate words and 2 separate concepts. Probability doesn't mean that you're certain. So,
exactly.
Okay, that was a longer introduction probably than we needed. But at any rate,
that's good to set the stage, because you're absolutely right that this is a good section that shows he goes, it's like, well, could be this or could be this or could be this. And in the end, he doesn't have enough evidence to say one way or the other, but he's also saying that, any one of these possibilities fits the phenomenon that we can get through our senses.
Right. And so as we get back to the text for today, this first sentence is something that we end up probably needing to find as a reference fairly regularly, because Epicurus will talk about the world or the worlds. And this is where he's telling us what he means when he says that.
Yeah.
That it's not just the Earth, nor is it the solar system or a particular constellation. You want to talk about how you interpret that? And
I think
we can get Martin in too.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that the thing that I think Bailey has a much better, smoother translation, but that word that he uses, sky, is really problematic. And in Hicks actually translates it as universe. And the word in the original Greek is Uranos, which is, of course, the planet Uranus. It can commonly refer to the sky, but it can also refer to the universe. So a world or a cosmos is a circumscribed portion of the universe. So whenever he starts talking later then that there are many worlds, he's not talking about Saturn and Mars and Earth. He's talking about the whole world system. I think world system is probably a better translation of cosmos than world. And that really sets up a confusion, I think, in some of the texts that we read in translation, because we tend to think of the world as just the Earth, and it's definitely not referring to that.
Let's get Martin. What are you thinking about this too, Martin? Because it's also not, I'm tempted to say that he's talking about one of these rotating galaxies, but he's not really, I don't think, even saying that. It's almost like he's saying everything that we can perceive from where we are.
Yeah, and it's almost that whole visible universe sort of thing. I mean, with us. But I think it's interesting later down where he starts talking about that a world can form inside another world. And one thing I think we have to keep in mind, too, is that the perspective of the ancient Greeks is so different from our own, because they're thinking of, even Epicurus is thinking of a geocentric cosmos with the shells that hold the sun and the moon and the stars, that circle the earth. And, of course, later down he talks about the different shapes that it can be. But in some ways, it's the observable universe that we are talking about, because, in some ways you can say the Earth is at the center of the observable universe, but every infinite point would be the center of its own observable part of the universe. But yeah, it's a whole different mindset, but at least it's consistent with the way he's reasoning from his perspective.
The first thing he says in 89 is that such worlds are infinite in number, we can be sure. So whatever it is we're talking about, there's an infinite number of them. So Martin, how do you unwind all this?
Yeah, I mean, like Don already said, we will not have known what we know today, but to me, the obvious analogies are that a word of what he thinks of fits to what we consider a solar system or a galaxy. So those are most similar to what he describes there. it fits to both of them about equally.
Which means, I guess, we are in the Milky Way galaxy. Is that the way we describe it? And so we can see all these other stars that are in the Milky Way, but we can also see stars that are not in the Milky Way. And I guess that's the problem with us considering it to be a galaxy. But you're right. It sort of does correspond, it seems to me in my mind, most closely to what we would think of as a galaxy. To say that there's an infinite number of galaxies would make sense to us, I think.
Yeah, and most of what we see outside the galaxy are actually galaxies and not individual stars.
Yeah, and I thought farther down, whenever he starts talking about the whirlings, that'll be a good spot to sort of bring in the idea of either solar systems or galaxies or something like that. But again, like I said, it's such a different mindset from what we know now as far as what science and astronomy have shown us, that I hesitate to use the word logically consistent, but he's logically consistent within the worldview of ancient Greece in a totally material-based universe perspective. But I think that there are interesting analogies, though, that can be made between the way he's thinking and the way that, science has shown the universe is actually set up. And that's what always surprises me. He's not talking about, chaos and Kronos and the war of the gods setting up the world and all that sort of thing. I mean, the analogies, at least, are the parallel lines of thought, I think, are really interesting.
We're talking about most of the sort of affirmative aspects of it. One clause here that catches my eye that we haven't really mentioned would be whose dissolution will cause all within it to fall into confusion. So even as he's discussing the nature of what a world is, he's bringing back the point that everything that comes together will eventually fall apart, including a world.
Yep, exactly. And he's talking about the boundary between the cosmos, the world. I just hate that word world. Sorry. So he's talking about, that there's a boundary of some kind around the cosmos. And he's also saying that boundary can be, rare or dense. So it can be thin, it could be thick, it could be stationary, it could be rotating. He's not really sure, nothing precludes thinking of any of those particular options. It can be, spherical, or it can be three-cornered, or any kind of shape. But that boundary is what sets the cosmos, the order, apart from the rest of the universe, the entire rest of the universe where all the other cosmoses live. So that's one of the things I think. It's almost, in my head, I envision this like if you're blowing bubbles, and each bubble is its own cosmos. And so if that very thin film of the bubble hits something else or hits another bubble, it's going to pop. And that's exactly the sort of analogy that I'm seeing here with him talking about that the dissolution of that boundary is the complete destruction of the cosmos that's within it.
Martin, when you see all these astronomical pictures of all these highly colored and organized and intricately shaped areas, what's the best term for like the Horsehead Nebula? For some reason that comes to my mind right this second. Is there a catch-all term? That's not a constellation. I guess the fact that you call it a nebula tells you that it's whatever a nebula is, that's what it is, as opposed to a constellation. But when he says it's a circumscribed area cut off from the rest of the infinite. So a circumscribed area, and it could be spherical or three-cornered or revolving or stationary. Is there a generic term for how we organize these things today in our minds? You see where I'm going? Is it constellation, nebula, galaxy? Is there any kind of a generic term for those formations?
Yeah, actually nebula is the generic term for dust formations, which are between stars and or even between galaxies, and it's this dust from which galaxies and stars are formed.
Yeah, I think that we can, and this is one of the parts I think that where it's really hard to make a direct comparison between how he's describing the cosmos and how we think of the universe now, because it really seems to me, especially whenever he talks about that the destruction of that boundary would mean the destruction of everything within that cosmos, is that he's really considering it that the ordered universe with the Earth at its center is some sort of, contained in some sort of little shell that, if you pop the shell, it's going to destroy everything. Just like if you cracked an egg, the contents of the egg are going to just, pour out, and everything's going to be, you're going to get scrambled eggs. So you'd get a scrambled cosmos if that boundary is destroyed. But and that's where I think as to go down this road, I think that as modern Epicureans trying to apply the philosophy with because the physics are still foundational to understanding the whole material-based philosophy that it's hard to make a one-to-one comparison. But I think Martin's on the right track about thinking about, galaxies and solar systems, and I think that in thinking of the galaxies as analogous to these cosmos or cosmoi for a modern day perspective on the Epicurean physics. But back then, my understanding is that he's saying exactly what he means, that if that shell or that boundary that surrounds the cosmos gets punctured or cracked or destroyed somehow, that everything within there, because that's the basic meaning of the word cosmos is order. So a cosmos is an ordered section of the universe that's cut off from the rest of the total universe, the infinite, the unlimited. And that's where things can that's where there's enough stability that the atoms can come together and form planets and stars and moons and that sort of thing.
Okay, help me with what I'm about to say here, because I know that I'm not going to say it very well. But is there not, maybe from his perspective, maybe from our own perspective today, is there not something useful in analogizing atoms coming together to form bodies as opposed to worlds within the infinite? In other words, how do atoms come together to form a body? And is there some at least useful analogy of thinking between the components of a world coming together to form a world? Silence out here, but here's my science fiction reading in the past. Aren't there people who have these theories that there's an obvious analogy between electrons orbiting protons versus the planets of a solar system? There's that fairly obvious analogy. But wouldn't it be true that Epicurus is really concerned about, he's got this big picture, which is that the universe is infinite, but he has to come up with a understandable method of, well, how does this infinite universe, how do discrete things within the infinite universe come together? I think there's an analogy in Lucretius about if you had an infinite void, but you did not have an infinite amount of matter, then nothing would ever come together. It would always be like a shipwreck with just flotsam and jetsam floating everywhere.
Right. Yeah. And he says, that, a world, a cosmos can only form where there's just enough void, but it's not a completely empty space, because if it was a completely empty space, there wouldn't be any seeds, any atoms to come together and start to form these parts of the earth and the stars and the moon, and there wouldn't be enough there. But it has to be vacant enough that there's room for these seeds to come together and grow into the world that we understand that we're living on. And it seems to me that this is almost, and again, I hate to go down this track either, but I think that it almost seems to me that whenever he's talking about, an infinite number of cosmos, an infinite number of cosmoi, that it's that whole, multiverse sort of thing that some theoretical physicists talk about now. I think it's easier to wrap our brain around thinking of the cosmoses as galaxies, because there is a way that you can think about the galaxies are separated from each other, and it's sort of that if you want to think of that as a world system, a cosmos as each galaxy, and that's sort of you can wrap your brain around it that way. Or like I said, you can think of because they've even been described as like bubble universes and things like that's almost closer, I think, to what Epicurus had envisioned for the way he thinks of the cosmos and the universe, as opposed to, because they're still thinking of the shell surrounding the earth, holding the stars and the moon and the celestial objects and that sort of thing. My turn for the stunned silence.
I'm trying to figure out how to organize our presentation here, because to some extent it looks like all of what we're talking about today fits under this category of how does a world form, and what is the implications of that. But on the other hand, I know we were talking before we started that there's a lot of material here, and so I don't want to collapse it into just a conclusion. I want to go make sure that we hit up the points that can be brought out to bring out the detail.
I did find it interesting that he says that a cosmos, a world, can come into being both inside another world and in the interworld. And he's talking about that. I found that's the first time that I've seen interworld used as a word for the intermundia. Usually we talk about the intermundia because the conversations about the gods and things, but that interworld I kind of like even better than intermundia, because it really gets to the idea that it's the space between the different cosmoi. It's a space between the different world systems, and that it's fairly empty. It's just, it has some atoms floating around in there somewhere, but then it's a space where these ordered sections circumscribed from the rest of the universe can actually form.
Well, I guess you're probably in your commentary there, you're probably in 89 as the line that we're looking at now. I noticed that the very last part of 89 says that these combinations can last as long as the underlying foundations are capable of receiving additions.
Right.
So there's another reference there to the duration in time of a world having a beginning and an end.
And that's that was one of the interesting parts that I thought that really was almost, and Martin can say if I'm on the right track here, but that was almost seemed to be almost exactly the way planets and galaxies form and solar systems form, that you have, materials coming together and they go up to a certain point, and then after that certain point, then there's a sort of a level of stability, and then that's whenever the solar systems and the planets themselves can form. That whole idea of the seeds rushing in from somewhere else and forming in this case, the world. But that seems to me to be, spot on as to how the planetary bodies and everything else gets aggregated.
Yes, because it's formulated rather broadly, it reasonably fits on the different mechanisms. Of course, the stars have a different way of formation than the planets do, and again, galaxies form differently. But because Epicurus formulates it general enough, so we can see this as reasonably covered by it.
Exactly. And I thought it was interesting too that he talks about that they can accumulate up to a certain point, and then after that he seems to imply that there's a sort of equilibrium that happens, and then it's stable for a while, and then eventually it's going to dissolve anyway. But that whole idea of that accumulation and equilibrium, just that those lines just floored me there.
Yeah, but the funny thing is, where does he really get the idea from that it dissolves?
Right.
So that one is something unexpected for them, and I wouldn't think of any phenomena which would really have led him to that one, because the way this happens doesn't concern a whole galaxy as a whole, unless it gets sucked up by a black hole in its center. But I haven't seen that worked out completely yet. But what happens is for stars which are much larger than our sun, they will eventually explode in a supernova. And this is where then the formation of new stars will form. So they throw out their parts as dust. No? So this is where this nebula gets their matter from the supernova. And this is also where then still now we have then in the space the dust being there. And but there is no real limit for once the star is there to accumulate more. So as much as it travels to the space, the dust which is in that path is most likely gets caught by the star, and also the planets will accumulate this. So I think I heard somewhere that we are accumulating, how much was that? The Earth keeps growing because it accumulates this space dust. No? And this is why we also see things that, like, for example, the Roman case at the River Rhine are much lower than where the inner city of Cologne is now, and I got the explanation. This is from the space dust.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you that it's I'm trying to figure out where he got the idea, because it doesn't seem like that. I mean, the accumulation of dust is sort of almost generational and over centuries and that sort of thing to sort of get the idea there. But yeah, as far as the physical phenomena that are observable, I'm just still wondering where he got that. The only thing I did make a note of Lucretius, book 2, line 11 and 12, and that sort of maybe hints at where he was coming from. And if you'll indulge me here, it's and this is actually from the Stallings translation. So it's the atoms that compose each substance are apportioned to it by the rain of blows from every direction, being drawn to what's the same. Water adds to water, earth increases earth, and flame forges flame, air, till nature, maker of things, brings each to the zenith of its growth, the upper limit it can reach, that stage when no more can be added to the vital veins than that which flows already in them and now ebbs and drains. So Lucretius talks about the idea that water is attracted to water and earth's attracted to earth and air is attracted to air. So that's one way, I guess, that if he thought of it theoretically, that if there are different seeds that are naturally attracted to each other, because he wasn't necessarily, Epicurus, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't big into the idea of air, earth, fire, and water as being the only elements, but maybe,
Right.
different atoms of like kinds attracted each other, and that's where they start to form together.
Yeah, that he doesn't even state this one clearly, So it's more like he thinks of them having shapes, and because of these shapes, if enough of them happen to be together, they can then be entwined into each other. Because he doesn't know about the attractive the action we know of, no?
Right.
So
Right.
for him, it's really something mechanical. So these are hard bodies with shapes, and then they just hook into each other.
Yeah, the little atoms with like hooks and things, and they get jumbled up with each other and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I think what we've been talking about the last couple of minutes was where he got the impression that maybe the stars or these formations in the sky would eventually pass away again. And I would say one potentially obvious explanation for that was at the end of passage 87, right before we started this, he said, now we can obtain indications of what happens above from some of the phenomena on Earth. So I would presume that, again, my inarticulate asking of the question some 15 minutes ago was, is he analogizing the things we see about formation of worlds with the formation of bodies here on Earth? I think probably that's the obvious answer, is that he takes what we observe here on Earth and he considers whether that is a potential part of the explanation of what's going on in the sky, even though we can't get close enough to see it. And you analogize the sky from those things that you do know here on Earth.
Exactly.
There's one way you get there. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and I could even see things if he would observe even things like, baking bread or that sort of thing, that you throw flour or whatever, you throw ingredients into a bowl, and it makes a new hole, and it sticks together, and any sort of like mortar and that sort of thing. There's ways to construct things from smaller bits, and you aggregate them together and you get something bigger. And then you can't build a wall that's infinitely tall or it'll fall over. So you reach an equilibrium point in even things like masonry walls and things like that. And it's like, oh, okay, so you could have atoms come together and you get to a certain point, and after that, then it's a point of equilibrium, and then it can't take any more material to itself. So that I guess is one analogy that is possible there as well.
Yeah, I didn't prepare today to have good cross references over to Lucretius, but when you talk about bread accumulating, I'm pretty sure Lucretius talks about that's the way the human bodies or other bodies grow. You take in food until you get to your zenith, and then at some point you start losing your atoms and you waste away. And then I know that there's a long section in Lucretius as well about the end of the earth, about talking about how earthquakes and floods and volcanoes and other natural disasters seem to shake the foundation of the earth as we've seen it ourselves. And if those had been just stronger, then the whole world might have blown apart at that point.
Yep, exactly. And I did think it was interesting where he talks about the number of worlds being infinite, that the section that specifically talks about that in Lucretius is in Book 2, starting around line 1048, and it's just a wonderful passage talking about the infinite number of worlds and that sort of thing. And I think that I get the impression that the whole idea of infinite worlds, infinite cosmoi, just blew people's minds back then, is the impression that I'm getting. That I think that it seems to me, the way that Epicurus talks about it and Lucretius talks about it, that the overriding general consensus was there's one world and there's one earth and there's one sky and there's that sort of thing. And Epicurus comes along and goes, hey, check this out. There could be an infinite number of these things, and it's like, so I think that whole idea just amazes me that he came up with that idea, and it's logically consistent in the I think, because he talks about infinite universe. It's like, well, if there's an infinite universe, how do we end up living in this nice ordered section of it? And this is his exact description of how we come to live in this ordered piece of the universe that we can it's not only ordered, but it's ordered in a way that we can understand it if we investigate it and look for evidence and use our senses and that sort of thing.
And that's another general comment we ought to always not get too far from, would be that he's saying all these things in the context of a bunch of people around him who would just totally in the thrall of a mystical explanation for the universe, considering these things in the sky basically either gods themselves or just being totally commanded to exist and moved around by the gods. And so even though his explanations might be general and we would revise them significantly today, in comparison to what he was talking about, and in fact, in comparison to the way many people even today still think of these things, you can throw all the detail about astronomical discoveries you want and nebula and black holes and things. You can throw all that stuff at a lot of people in the world still today, and it bounces off them like water off a goose. It's just like they're going to stay a goose, and they're going to ascribe everything that you're talking about to the divine order from the beginning of time for the great supernatural God. And all these details you're telling them just have no significance to them at all.
I thought it was interesting, as you mentioned mystical there, and I thought it was interesting as a piece of trivia where he talks about that the cosmos can be round or triangular or any shape at all. I saw a note in one source that I used was that the Pythagoreans conceived of a triangular cosmos, and that it was Empedocles that said that it was egg-shaped. So he's bringing in, at least to my mind, specifically talking about those other theories that are out there. And he's like, well, it could be this shape or it could be this shape. In the end, the shape of it doesn't really matter. The fact that it is a circumscribed portion of the infinite, that's the important thing. I mean, right now we can't get close enough to touch the boundary and figure out what shape it is. But any one of these shapes could work in the theory that I'm putting forward.
And presumably his infinite has no shape at all.
Exactly. It just goes on without boundary. Yeah. I did think that was interesting. And there are various words that Epicurus uses throughout his text to refer to the universe. My favorite is still the all, in the Greek, the topon. And I think that the fact that it's literally just the all, the everything, that encompasses, all of reality. And I think it's a really interesting way to refer to it. Another one is the infinite or the boundless, which is apeiros. So that's literally, no limit, no boundary. So there's those sorts of things that it's really, I mean, anytime you start to talk about infinite or infinity in any context, it's really hard to wrap your brain around. I don't know. Martin may have a better grasp on it than I do, but just sort of envisioning something that's infinite is not that easy.
Martin, can you envision the infinite for us?
This is difficult because I know the mathematics.
Exactly.
Because I know the math, then it's clear to me from the math. But how do you explain this to someone who does not know the math?
And do I understand that there are different types of infinity? Am I correct in reading that somewhere?
Yes. So you can have countable infinity, and you have I forgot the proper English term for it, where it's overcountable. That means you cannot. So the counter one means you can make, numerate them, and then like the rational numbers, no. So even though there are more rational numbers than how to say this? Now, in a given interval, there are more rational numbers, actually an infinite number already, whereas you have in that in interval only a finite number of natural numbers. But in the infinite, you can define an ordering such that you can identify for each rational number a natural number in which we enumerate it. No? So in that way, so the rational numbers they have a numerable. It's a numerable type of infinite, whereas the real numbers are beyond that. You cannot give something like this. No? So these are the two different levels of infinite, and that refers them basically just how dense they are put together. If you look at this on an axis, no? So that means the rational numbers are dense, but they have gaps, the discrete gaps, and the real numbers don't have gaps.
God, and I seem to even remember that Epicurus talks about numbers of things that they're countable, but there's not enough time to actually count them all or something like that. Do I remember that correctly? Something along those lines, Cassius?
I do remember some lines that talk about some things are not infinite but merely innumerable. Or
There,
something
that's
like
it.
that.
Right. That's the word. Innumerable was the one. Yes. So
That's a different type. The different types of atoms. So he thought of them being innumerable, whereas we now meanwhile know, as far as we can see, there is quite a finite number.
But that's a very difficult concept because, like you say, Don, I'm thinking too that when he says innumerable, sometimes I guess that means that he sort of implies that you could count them if you had enough time.
Right. Because you can't have an infinite number of atoms because then they would never be able to come together because there wouldn't be any room for them. So yeah. So that whole push and pull between the infinite and the innumerable and that sort of thing. And
let me go back up what you just said there. I think we do have an infinite number of atoms and an infinite void.
Right.
It's the shapes, I think. If I remember correctly, maybe it's either the shapes or I think it is the shapes or sizes that are innumerable.
So the reason why he needs that they are not just infinite is because we need to have different types, otherwise we would not have stability in the phenomenon.
Right.
But there's a limit of some kind in the numbers of types because if I remember correctly, there's a discussion that the sizes of the atoms are not limitless, or else we would be able to see a single atom.
Right.
They would grow to be so large that or a single atom could take over the universe.
So there have to be repeated types of the individual atoms have to fall in these classes. Of each of them, we have many or actually infinite of them, because otherwise would not have this repetition of things of the same kind. No? So that is an indication that we have the atoms of the same type. But at the same time, he sees a large variety of, I almost would have said forms, but that's misleading. But phenomena which look very different. And that's why he thinks that their number is innumerable.
And I did think real quick to the part that talks about the sun and moon and the other stars were not created by themselves and subsequently taken in by the world, but were fashioned from it. I thought that was a very cool way to put that. And like I said, that seems to be, almost spot on as to how stars and planets are formed there again, just to sort of re-emphasize that I thought was a really interesting way to look at it. That they weren't, and I get the idea that he's talking there about that they weren't, divinely created, out of chaos or something, and that they're part of the ordered world system, and they came into being with it, and they'll go out of existence whenever it goes out of existence.
I agree with what you just said. Now, when you started there, I asked myself, where is he finding that in section 89? And you have just leapfrogged over to the end of section 90 is when you said that. So that's a good point. We'll keep that in mind. But as we were talking a few minutes ago, I was looking at 90 and saying, my gosh, there's some really important stuff in 90. So I'm going to make sure we call attention to that. Let's go to the first section of what we're looking at here of 90, because it looks to me like there's something going on here. You got one of these situations where he's got an opposing group of philosophers again. So warning bells should go off when he starts talking about the so-called physical philosophers saying something. Yeah. And it looks like that this is a determinism or necessity observation, which he says the physical philosophers and their theory is a contradiction of phenomena. So we'll finish on the sun and the moon and the stars not being created by themselves. But what's this discussion here in the beginning of 90 about it's not merely necessary for gathering of atoms to take place? Maybe I should put the emphasis on the word necessary, for it is not merely necessary for a gathering of atoms to take place, nor indeed for a whirl and nothing more to be set in motion as is supposed by necessity. It's hard to read. I'm not sure where to put the emphasis and how to make sense out of it. But if you look at the different sections, it appears that he is opposing a particular contention that these physical philosophers are asserting. And it looks like he's talking about something involving necessity. So help me figure out what the first part of 90 is talking about and how that contradicts phenomena for their theory to be correct. Anybody make sense of that?
I mean, we would have to see this in some way, that what we see on the sky, that something keeps growing as much until it hits something else, which also keeps growing. But what we see in the sky is that except for the few known planets visible and the occasional comet, the sky is fairly stable.
Don?
Yeah, I agree with Martin. I agree with Martin. I did see that whenever he talks about that, some of the people said that they grow until they collide with each other. That evidently Democritus held that things could just keep growing and then the cosmoses could run into each other. And so evidently he's setting himself apart from Democritus too.
Okay, so you guys are focusing on this issue of a world growing until it collides with another world as the end point of that world.
Mm-hmm. And that's evidently what Epicurus doesn't hold to that, because he seems to be saying that that's not the way the world ends. So,
why is the issue of growing until you hit another world something that is a necessitarian viewpoint? Is Epicurus saying that it doesn't have to grow till it hits another world? It can explode at any moment. Is that what he's saying? Or
that's the gist that I get from it. Because I guess he doesn't, as far as the continuing to grow, he doesn't see that. I mean, you look up in the sky and you don't see the sun continuing to get bigger or the stars getting bigger. And I think and evidently Democritus had some sort of theoretical perspective that he was like, well, that's what's going to happen. Things keep getting bigger and they're going to collide with each other. And Epicurus is like, well, yeah, that contradicts phenomena.
Let me ask this. Don't we often associate the hard determinism with the billiard ball viewpoint, that everything's going to go in a particular direction until it hits something else, because it's a billiard ball. It has no ability to do anything else. Is this a potential hint at either the swerve or just indeterminism that results from something other than collision?
No. Because on the macroscopic part, the swerve is not visible.
Okay, but again, what is he saying here that can happen to a world before it collides with another one?
Well, I think he's also saying there with the beginning there, let me just, if you don't mind, let me just read it here. So, for it is not merely necessary for a gathering of atoms to take place, nor indeed for a whirl and nothing more to set in motion in an empty space. So I think what he's saying there is that it's not enough for atoms to just go whirling about in something. There has to be some other sort of necessitating cause for the world to start forming, it looks like to me. Because just the sheer whirling around an empty space isn't enough. There has to be some sort of, and I think maybe this goes back to the whole idea of the boundary, the circumscribed portion of the universe, that there has to be a place for this stuff to sort of be able to work its, whirlings and motions in an ordered space so that they can accumulate and aggregate up to that place of equilibrium.
And the conditions need to be right that they can stick together.
Right,
so
exactly.
Just
yes.
Whirling around, they do not necessarily stick. So
right.
The right parts need to happen together that they can intertwine and more parts can attach to it. And that is not automatically by just something whirling around.
Right. I would agree with that. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Maybe I've made this harder by separating these two parts of 90. Maybe all of 90 is one together and there's no paragraph or other division, because maybe the answer to the question is in that part that Don has raised when we first started here. Sun and moons and stars were not created by themselves and subsequently taken in, but fashioned in it, and then gradually grew in size by the aggregations and whirlings of the bodies.
Yes. So what he does is that he refutes two alternative explanations.
Okay, so put all of 90 together, and what do you come up with?
Yeah, so it's not enough so just that things whirl around together. So there has to be more that they come together for a new world to form. And the second one is they do not just grow bigger and bigger until they hit another one.
Yeah, so it's sort of the he's talking about the beginnings and endings of a cosmos. And it does look like, at least in the Greek that I was looking at, that 89 and 90 are part of one section, and then the sun and moon part starts up another section.
Yeah. Everything we've been talking about today seems to stick together,
so to speak.
A general point. Yes. Not by whirling around or colliding with another one, but in reason. But okay, well, I wonder if there's any ability to unwind this. Each of those two sentences that we have in 90 end with a clause about either contradiction of phenomena or what our sensations suggests. So we were talking earlier about, I presume he is analogizing the things he sees in the skies to the things he sees around us. But when he starts talking about that the sun and the moon and the stars weren't created by themselves, for this is what our sensations suggest. What does our sensations suggest in this regard? What sensation is he talking about? Vision of what we see in the sky, or is it the sensation of the things we're seeing around us, which we're then analogizing, or both? Probably, but does anything jump out at you as to what our sensation suggests as the meaning of that?
Well, I think again, he's talking about that you have to have, nothing comes from nothing. So you have to have the atoms that were pre-existent and then the little circumscribed portion of the universe to come together to form those sun and moon and planets and stars and that sort of thing. That's at least my first impression from reading that as a whole.
And of course, now that I'm looking at these paragraphs, I'm looking at the last phrase of each paragraph. These last two paragraphs talk about contradiction of phenomena and the senses. The last section of 89 talks about these worlds last as long as the underlying foundations are capable of receiving additions. So it's almost like everything we're talking about with these worlds and their formation and their end, we're concluding based on it looks to me like he's saying that we're concluding these things based on our observations of the way things come together here on Earth. Mm-hmm. And that a body here on Earth, quote, lasts as long as the underlying foundations are capable of receiving additions. Yeah. That applies to rocks and trees and Martin.
And buildings
and Cassius, everything.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Once our foundations of any body have been stretched past the breaking point, then everything begins to fall apart.
Yep.
But as long as the foundation holds and you're capable of receiving additions, you grow. I do think that there's a section in Lucretius where there's a significant discussion about you're either growing or dying. It seems like there's really not a. That would be a point in Epicurean philosophy, presumably, that there really is no rest. There is no resting point. There's no resting place. There's
the atoms are always in motion.
Everything's in motion.
Everything,
yes.
Yeah. Everything's in motion, but not so much motion that we can't wrap our brains around it. His idea was that was his opposition to the whole idea of you can't step in the same river twice thing. That's like, well, the river's still there. I can still step in it. It might not be the exact same river, but I could. You're just overcomplicating things, I think, is what he would say.
Yeah, even when you're in some kind of apparent equilibrium where things seem to be staying the same, you're losing and replacing at the same time. Right. Like that river you're talking about, the water is flowing.
Exactly. And again, that's where he talks about his whole idea of the atoms or the seeds, rushing in either from other parts of the world to form another world, or rushing in from the interworld and that sort of thing. So they're flowing in and coming together and forming their own little orderly portion of the circumscribed universe.
Yes, between areas of the universe, but never from outside the universe, because there is no
outside. Exactly. There's an outside the world. There's a between worlds, but there is no outside the universe. Yep. Right. Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Yeah, this was an interesting section to sort of wrap your brain around that ancient Greek, mindset of the, what kind of quote unquote world everybody lives in. So I think that trying to wrap your brain around that and then analogizing to the current scientific findings, I think it's an interesting exercise.
Yes, it is very interesting. Help me with this. I think, Don, you and I may have discussed this. I think this is something that I'm getting from DeWitt, but I believe DeWitt or somebody else makes this observation that, just as sort of the general foundational basic Epicurean attitude towards the universe. You've got the forces of destruction and the forces of creation within the universe that are constantly going on. All this motion, things are growing, dying, being born all the time. Mm-hmm. But from an overall perspective, the forces of destruction never totally prevail because the universe as a whole is never destroyed.
Right.
And I don't want to wrap that into too much of a poetic or semi-mystical aura, but I think at least that's why DeWitt brings it up, is because there's ultimately something Another theme of my concern, nihilism. Yes, the universe is constantly changing. Yes, things are constantly being destroyed and born and changed and so forth. But in the big picture, the forces of destruction never ultimately prevail.
Right.
And I don't know exactly how that translates into a attitude towards the universe, but I think it's relatively straightforward that you could take that as a positive thing. Right. It's not an ultimate negative thing that everything is ultimately destined to cease to exist as we know it, yes, but not totally cease to exist.
Yeah, exactly. What atoms and void.
Does anybody have any comment on that? Because I think ultimately that's and maybe that's something else. It's one of these things that's so obvious that it doesn't need to be said. I don't know if there's some analogy with yin and yang or whatever, but you have all these different people who have, Mars versus Venus. You have all these opposing forces,
love
all
and
these
strife,
things.
Yeah.
Yes, all these things that are constantly changing each other, interworking among each other. But in the end, nature goes on.
Right. Yep.
That's not exactly the most inspirational way that I could put all that. But I think that if you're looking for an ultimate inspirational overall viewpoint of the universe, I think you would go in that direction. Because we've discussed this many times. I don't think Epicurus is ultimately a negative, nihilistic, cynical person. Yeah. He's got a basic underlying positive attitude about things.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Well, it always comes back too with putting theory into practice. I mean, everything that Epicurus talks about in the end has to have a practical benefit for mankind, because we can talk about the destruction of the universe and that maybe that helps keep things in perspective, but you always go back to the words of the philosopher have to have a practical benefit for the happiness of mankind.
Martin, your thoughts there? Or we're getting to the end of a normal episode length, so any thoughts on any aspect of what we've been discussing today?
Just a small addition comment on this collision of worlds. No? So that means what we may observe is collisions of galaxies, but this is just because their paths along their paths they're hitting each other. It's not because they grew into each other. No?
Yeah, good point. I'm surprised, and I'm not saying that we should, but I think it's interesting that we didn't even bring up the gods in the intermundium today. So I think that's probably another topic for another episode. But the fact that he talks about the nature of the interworld in this section is that's I would have to go back and look at Cicero and that sort of thing and see what details are there about the intermundium, but that's exactly the region that we're talking about here with the space between worlds.
And of course, when you say that he does not bring up the intermundia at the moment, the best way to judge that is to sort of step back and think about where we're going. And next week, or when we get back to the letter to Pythocles, we will talk about the size of the sun and so forth. But you're right, as I'm trying to quickly scan over the upcoming paragraphs, and there really is nothing in the letter to Pythocles about the gods or living in the intermundia.
Specifically meteorological phenomenon and the universe and the cosmos and that sort of thing. So so it's not even though he brings up the gods on a fairly regular basis, and it's the first primary things in a lot of the texts. See that it's not pertinent to his summary to Pythocles here.
Not to play a memory game, but if somebody were looking for those sections, let's play a memory game. Where would they go? I'm thinking what we end up referring to today would be the Cicero's on the nature of the gods. The Velleius section talks about the most detail we have on that. And I guess Lucretius talks about the gods being in the intermundia. But as far as in the letters of Epicurus,
no.
Does he mention it at all?
No, I don't believe so. I think you'd have to probably go to one of the books of On Nature to talk about that.
And I'm not nearly as familiar with the surviving fragments of the On Nature book as I should be. Don, you probably more so. Do you think there are any fragments?
I believe there are. I mean, I think that's there. I would have to go back and look. It might even look. Sedley might even talk about it in the Transformation of Greek Wisdom. Lucretius and the Transformation of Greek Wisdom. So I would have to double check there too.
I guess, in thinking of another comment that I remember from DeWitt, it's almost as if Epicurus considered the details of the issues of the gods to be sort of an advanced topic that were not necessarily considered to be so important and basic that everybody.
I don't know about the topic of the gods. I mean, maybe where they live.
Yes,
but I think
yes,
that, I mean, it's right there in the letter to Menoikeus, so it's like right there at the top. So
right, certainly,
and I seem to remember PD1 as.
Yes, exactly.
One.
Exactly. So it's not the issue of the gods in general that's an advanced topic, but the details of where they live and how they talk and how they spend their time.
Yeah, exactly. That's not as nearly as important as having a proper attitude towards them.
Because as we all know, the gods speak Greek or a language like Greek. And I can see you would laugh at that and appreciate that, Don, since you studied more Greek than I have. And they don't have blood, but they have quasi blood and some things like that. According to, I think all that is in the latest material.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, Martin, any direct closing comments as we wrap up today?
No, nothing else.
All right. Don?
No, thanks for having me again, letting me fill in for Joshua. This was a fun little segment here to dig into.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to having you back soon. We're going to have to look at next week and see where we are because neither Joshua nor Don are going to be available. And we've been talking and building up some enthusiasm for a while to discuss this issue of the size of the sun. I've been threatening to begin all of my presentations with the size of the sun is as it appears. As sort of an incantation.
If anybody hasn't read that paper that was posted recently, they can get a hold of that. That's an interesting one.
Lucretius on the Size of the Sun by THM or TMH Geller Goad is what we've been discussing recently.
Yeah.
And some I think very, very insightful observations about how all that fits together. So we'll do that in 2 weeks. Martin and I will discuss what we want to do next week and see if we may take a break, but I think we're probably going to come up with something for next week so we don't lose any momentum because there's no rest in the universe. The atoms are constantly moving, so we never want to look for rest. But we'll do that next week, and Don will hope to have you back soon, and we will continue on through the letter to Pythocles.
All right. Have a good day, gentlemen.
All right. Thanks. We'll be back soon. Bye.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye-bye.